Well, hello. Welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name's Alistair Roth, Executive Director of IAEA Victoria. So welcome to our Dyson House audience and to our Zoom audience and members of the diplomatic corps joining us. I'd like to start by briefly acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So to discuss the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iraq, and the future of non-proliferation, and to discuss his new book, Transforming Nuclear Safeguards Culture, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Trevor Findlay. Welcome back, Dr. Trevor Findlay. Trevor is a former Australian diplomat. He's currently Principal Fellow at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. His lifelong specialization has been nuclear governance, particularly disarmament, arms control, non-proliferation, nuclear safeguards, the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and nuclear security. He's worked on chemical and biological disarmament and also UN peacekeeping operations. He's been a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board for Disarmament Matters, Board of the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and he's considered one of the world's leading experts on the IAEA. So Trevor, thank you very much for coming to talk to us. Please buy the book and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and it's great to be here at the Institute again, in person rather than online, but hello to everyone who is online. My book starts with a puzzle, like all good mystery novels. This was what Iraq declared before 1991, before the invasion of Kuwait, in terms of its nuclear facilities. As you can see, there are 3, not many. This is what UN inspectors discovered when they went in after the war with Kuwait. As you can see, many, many more facilities at this one site called Tuwaitha, which is not that far from Baghdad. In addition, Iraq had many other facilities as well. So this is just one, but I think it illustrates the challenge of safeguards and the fact that, at least in the case of Iraq, the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors missed the real situation. There are many more facilities at the same site over the berm, as they called it. So there were these sand berms hiding many of these facilities, but nonetheless, the inspectors appeared to have missed what was in plain sight on this, at this one location. So let me start with IAEA safeguards, just in case some of you don't know what they are. And I hope you can read these, but if not, I'll pretty much talk to the slides. So in terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, each party is obliged to sign a safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's a bilateral agreement. They're all based on a model, so they're all pretty much the same. The state agrees to declare all of its nuclear material and nuclear facilities. And I stress the word all here because that will be key to what I'm going to be talking about. The state's declaration is then verified by the IAEA and its inspectors, and this is done through nuclear materials accountancy, which, as it suggests, is just counting things and making sure they're the same as when the inspectors went the last time. That includes amounts of nuclear material and types and numbers of facilities. But the key is on-site inspections, and there are various types of these: random inspections, inspections to verify that a plant's design is as advertised. There are other means, of course, putting seals on equipment so inspectors know it hasn't been disturbed when they return. Video cameras. During the time of the Iraq crisis, there were video cameras available. Since then, there's much better technology, but at that time, there were video cameras in the plants. And then there's a possibility, if there's a problem, of so-called special inspections. And there, the agency can ask for additional access, additional information they can't determine the situation, if they're suspicious about something, in other words. If there is a major non-compliance situation, then the Secretariat, that is the civil servants, international civil servants, led by the Director General, can request a referral or a report to the UN Security Council. So the IAEA doesn't do the sanctions, doesn't do the punishment, if you like, of states or coercion. That's the job of the UN Security Council. The agency is the verification agency. So the question posed by those two charts, drafted by my good friend Laura Rockwood, a legal person at the agency, so they're pretty good. So why was Iraq missed? And in my book, I look at three different possibilities, grouped as politics, institutions, and culture. Essentially, my book is about the organizational culture of the IAEA. But I felt to be able to study the culture, I then had to look at other explanations for why Iraq was missed. I couldn't just zoom in on culture and say, well, this is it. So the book essentially studies the politics and the institutions in the arrangement and decides whether they answer all our questions about why Iraq was missed. And then I turn to culture. So in the political view of things, politics is everything. And I'm a political scientist, and I do tend to see politics behind everything, I have to admit. So I struggled with this idea of culture. But I've also taught international organization, and I know that institutions are also important. And in institutions, it's not just about politics. So in the case of the political view of things, everything is political. That's the extreme version. And action is taken through jockeying for power and negotiations. And certainly the IAEA was a negotiated body. It's got a statute that was negotiated by member states. Safeguards themselves were negotiated by member states. The Board of Governors is the most important states grouped in a board, and they manage the agency. They make decisions about compliance and non-compliance. And you can imagine that's a political body. Australia's a semi-permanent member of that body, and politics plays a huge part in that. The Secretariat, on the other hand, is not meant to be political, although even there, of course, politics play a part. The second category of explanation would be the institutional. And people who study international organizations and those who proposed them, in the past, mainly after the Second World War, thought they were some sort of machine that they could make efficient and effective. And the way to repair a machine is to make it even more efficient and effective. So there are whole streams of books written on how to make international institutions more effective and efficient. And their action comes through planning and management, as you can imagine. I'm very attracted to this as well. When I see a problem at the IAEA, I think, oh, yes, better planning and management would fix that problem. It's a very sort of natural thing to want to do. The third lens, and I call these lenses because they're not mutually exclusive, they're ways of just looking at a problem. Each in its turn does not explain everything. With culture, it's the hidden assumptions, the habits, the motivations that may probably be hidden and people don't like to talk about, that differ from the official line of an organization. So you'll have the propaganda that an organization puts out, or the official line, but then you'll have people who work in the organization say, well, that's not quite right. This is the way we do things around here, which indicates there's a culture, and the culture can often be at loggerheads with the way the organization says it's operates. You've all seen this, strategic plans that are put in the drawer and then people get on with their work. That indicates that the culture doesn't match the professed goals of the organization. And here action comes through habit and routine. You can probably all now start to think of ways that the culture where you work or you have worked in the past has not necessarily matched the goals of the organization. It's quite a fascinating thought, really. So let me just go briefly through the politics part. As I said, the IAEA was established by member states. It's largely funded by member states. And the old saying goes, you can bite the hand that feeds you, but you can't bite it off. So international organizations are wary of what their member states want and will obviously try to satisfy those demands. Often they're competing, which is good because the agency can play states off against one another. In the case of safeguards, the politics of this is crucial because when the safeguard system was designed, member states did not want them to be too intrusive, too expensive, too onerous, or impinge on their sovereignty, or in the case of Germany and Japan particularly, impinge on their commercial prospects for nuclear energy, exporting reactors, etc. Even Australia and Canada declined to include uranium under safeguards, and it wasn't. So the system was designed to exclude uranium mining in the beginning. It's since been amended, but in the early iterations of safeguards, uranium mining was excluded at the insistence of Australia and Canada. So not all nuclear activities were covered, and there were severe limits on the inspectorate on what it could do. And that was all because of politics, essentially. Let me come to the institutional explanations, and there is a view out there which I think is wrong, and we actually heard it from former Prime Minister Scott Morrison the other day, that there are these typical UN institutions which are basically useless. Bureaucratic, inflexible, inefficient. I think there are some elements of truth to that. I think the UN's got much better in recent decades at reforming itself. But in the case of the IAEA, it's been consistently ranked, including by the United States Government Accounting Office, as amongst the most effective and efficient. And certainly that's been my experience as well. The other issue with international organizations is that even though they're funded and established by states, they develop a certain autonomy. And there's something called the principal agent theory about this, which is that, and you've probably experienced this yourself, you give someone a job to do, you accord them the freedom and the funding to do the job, and then it turns out they run away with it. After a while, they'll develop more expertise about this subject than you had in the first place. And they develop a certain autonomy, and you're sort of stuck with it. You can't second guess them because of that. And that's what happens in international organizations, particularly ones with many, many members, because the agency can play states off against each other. And the IAEA has been around now since 1957. So they are the repositories of this incredible amount of expertise on nuclear governance that individual states, except the United States, France, UK, China, Russia, European Union, can't really match. All the others are left beholden to the IAEA for advice and assistance, even though they're the ones who fund it, and even though they're the ones who negotiated the organization's statute and safeguards agreements. And as I said, you can bite the hand that feeds you, but you can't bite it off. So there's this constant tension between the international organization and the member states about what they can do, what their autonomy is. Just a brief word about the inspectors. The inspectors originally were quite amateurish. This was a whole new undertaking to actually verify compliance by states with their nuclear obligations. And so it was pretty amateurish. They were stuck up on the 5th floor of a hotel in Vienna, and they really didn't know what they were doing. But they were poorly recruited, poorly trained. States would just volunteer names. They may not be qualified. They were certainly not well debriefed when they came back from their inspections. But much of this was improved by the 1980s. So I don't think we can blame missing Iraq on poor inspectors. The safeguards were applied to Iraq as to every other country. There was really no difference there. And as far as I can see, there's no evidence that inspectors were soft on Iraq. They tended to come from the Soviet Union and Ukraine and Hungary, and none of those states really wanted to see Iraq with nuclear weapons. So they weren't going to be soft on Iraq if you're conspiratorially minded. In fact, possibly quite the opposite. So a bit about organizational culture. I don't know if you can read that. There are people in these funny hats saying, I don't quite know how this started, but it's the culture of the place. I think that pretty much sums up what culture is. It's powerful, it's latent, it's often unconscious. And if you talk to people about the culture of the organization, they're often really reluctant to reveal the truth. They'll give you the line, the policy line. Culture is also very hard to analyze and interpret, and it's also related to work habits and to guidelines and to instructions and the hierarchy of an organization. So it's very difficult, at least for someone who's not trained in culture, rather political science, to pull these elements apart. And a dysfunctional culture can certainly cause an organisation to collapse or fail. We're seeing that, unfortunately, in the Victorian branch of the Labor Party in Victoria. There's talk of culture, right? The culture seems not to be fit for purpose. It's very hard to change culture because it's embedded. So the way cultures develop, if you don't fit in with the culture, you leave. Usually it's too hard to change. So you just fit in over time. And you can imagine over time, the culture just gets stronger and stronger because the people who stay and the people at the top have a vested interest in keeping things as they are. And sometimes if you force cultural change, you can have unintended consequences because people ignore the new instructions and they just go on their merry way. But above all, leadership is the key. So if the leaders set a good example and they know the cultural elements they're dealing with, then that can help enormously. So a very famous organisational theorist called Edgar Schein, and he's delved into culture, and he has 3 areas where you can examine culture. All this was foreign to me. I had no clue about this, so I had to learn it a lot. And I went to one of his acolytes at MIT and sat down for a whole morning, and he talked me through it and pretty much convinced me it was worthwhile. So the 3 areas you look at are the artifacts, so the things, whether it's the uniforms, the helmets, the procedures, the treaties in this case of the non-proliferation regime, the inspectors' guidelines, the forms they fill out when they do an inspection. All those things are artifacts, and they all give clues about the culture. Second is espouse values. So this is the party line I was telling you about, the strategies, the goals, the philosophies, all the good things that organizations say they do. And sometimes they do them, sometimes not. And then this is the most interesting part of all, the basic underlying assumptions. So unconscious, taken for granted beliefs, things that people don't really like to talk about, but they'll often blurt out when you interview them. And I'll show you some of those blurtings later on. So first, So first, a bit about what the Safeguards Agreement says in relation to the obligation of states. I told you that that word all was really important. So in every Safeguards Agreement, the comprehensive ones, Australia has one, Iraq had one. The agency shall have the right and the obligation to ensure that safeguards will be applied in accordance with the terms of this agreement on all source or fissionable material in all peaceful nuclear activities within the territory of, in this case, Iraq, under its jurisdiction and carried out under its control for the exclusive purpose of verifying that such material is not diverted to nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. That's what the Safeguards Agreement says. Seems pretty clear to me. Here's the cultural drift. I'll read these out because I'm sorry, the screen isn't very large. So the first quote is from Roger Housley, who worked for British Nuclear Fuels. And he went to Vienna with his boss to the IAEA, and they had a briefing on safeguards. So this is Roger, who's a terrific guy. This is Roger says. And I remember saying to him, this is the boss, after the briefing, I really don't understand why it is limited to the verification of declared material, because who would divert declared material? And with a slight air of superiority, he sort of tapped me on the head and said, well, eventually you'll get to understand what this is all about, Roger. The second quote is from Myron Kratzer, who's one of the world's leading experts on safeguards. He's passed away now. And this was an interview done with Pacific Northwest Laboratories, who did an oral history of safeguards. How anyone could pick up this safeguards document that says in paragraph 2 that the agency's obligation, right and obligation, is to apply safeguards to all material and to end up saying, well, all we really have to do is to apply our safeguards to declared material. It's to me the mystery of safeguards. And finally, Rick Hooper, who designed the system. This is really telling. In the same series of oral history interviews, he said, I went to considerable effort and I was certainly in a position to find out why did things develop the way they did. Why the focus on declared vis-a-vis undeclared, where the basic undertaking of states clearly provided the possibility of both. But in the end, the conclusion I came to was all these questions are largely rhetorical, that there is no answer. It's just that way. So I mentioned that phrase before, the way we do things around here. That's a classic quote from Rick Hooper, who probably never heard of safeguards culture. So how could this happen? How could this cultural drift happen away from paragraph 2, which you're all now familiar with, to not looking in Iraq for what had not been declared? You saw the initial charts, what was declared, what not declared. How could this possibly happen? How could IAEA safeguards inspectors miss this? Well, safeguards were originally seen as a gentleman's agreement, or gentleperson's agreement, I should say. Why would states go to all the trouble of negotiating this agreement and have safeguards inspectors visiting them every so often when they weren't serious? Why would they violate their obligations? So it was regarded as almost automatic that if a state had a safeguards agreement, they would comply with it. Secondly, and these gets into more psychological factors, complacency. Up until Iraq, no state had ever tried to set up undeclared activities and facilities, as far as anyone knew. That's always the mystery. But yes, there'd been no case like Iraq before. So of course, human beings just developed this sense that, well, no, that's never going to happen because it hasn't happened, like 9/11. Also, in the beginning, you can imagine this is entirely new enterprise, this safeguards business. Inspectors on sovereign territory, who ever heard of that? So it was challenging enough to verify what was declared. That was confronting enough. So the people at Lucas Heights, for instance, at the nuclear reactor, suddenly there are inspectors there looking at what's going on. So you can imagine for a state, this is quite confronting, and it was hard for the inspectors to do, hard for them to get the trust of the state and to figure out the technicalities of how they were going to do this. And it's a human tendency, I'm afraid, to only notice what we can count, only worry about what we can count. So over time, the inspectors became fascinated and obsessed with counting, but counting what they could see, not counting what they couldn't see, of course. And it was really unclear how you found out about undeclared facilities. There were ways, which I'll talk to later on, but that inspectors, after a while, didn't see that as their job. They had a chart, a checklist, they had equipment to count things and to monitor things, put seals on things, change the batteries in the cameras and go home. And after a while, after 30 or so years, that's what people do, right? It's habit. Everything was fine. There was no problem anywhere in any country. The agency was verifying all sorts of states, different types of technologies, different types of material. There's also a linguistic difficulty here. The safeguards agreement uses diversion, which in English suggests moving something from somewhere to somewhere else, diverting material from a declared facility to somewhere else. But that's not what Iraq did. Iraq just built a whole different infrastructure in the same area, in many cases, as what they declared. So diversion doesn't quite, in English, seem to fit. I don't know about other languages. And that strikes me as a difficult issue. States were clearly unwilling to accept fishing expeditions, as they called them, fair enough, or provide intelligence information. So the agency, even though it had the right to ask for special inspections, and even though it had the right to look for undeclared facilities, it over time just pulled back. No special inspection was ever requested. And after a while, it just became this huge deal. Eventually, they asked North Korea for one and said, no, thank you very much. And that was the end of that. It's never asked for one since. So again, that's a cultural thing. Special inspections just loomed large because they'd never been used. And everyone's thinking, oh, gee, if we use this special inspection, it's going to point the finger at a state. Well, that really wasn't the intention. It was meant to be for anomalies that occurred, not necessarily pinpointing any state that would violate their obligations. There's also cognitive dissonance here. There were signs that Iraq was up to something. Well, Israel bombed the reactor in front of everyone's noses, and everyone assumed that life would go on as normal. And it's true. No one really paid extra attention to Iraq after the Israeli bombing, which destroyed one reactor, but left the fuel intact, which Iraq then attempted to use for a bomb, and left a smaller reactor intact. So you think that would be a wake-up call. There were media reports of Iraq importing technologies. The French forced Iraq to go for a different sort of technology because they were worried that Iraq would be making the bomb. An Italian company, even though it sold equipment to Iraq, was suspicious. They weren't quite sure what Iraq wanted this material for. But humans are rather good at looking the other way if something doesn't fit in with their paradigm. And inspectors weren't charged with looking on the media, much less social media, which didn't exist, or using intelligence information, or even reading The Economist and thinking, oh, some journalist thinks there's something going on in Iraq. They weren't permitted to use that information at that time. This is a bit of a complicated chart, and I won't dwell on it, just to say that the IAEA has changed since Iraq. And it's changed its culture, but in an inadvertent fashion. What it's done is change the artifacts, which it needed to. The most famous one of this, you may have heard of it, is the Additional Protocol. So the Additional Protocol is a new agreement attached to countries' safeguards agreement, which allows the agency greater access, complementary access if they think something's amiss, and charges the state with providing essentially cradle to grave information about their nuclear facilities. So that's a huge improvement. Unfortunately, it's voluntary. Australia was the first country to have an additional protocol. It's working very well for the countries that signed it. Iran got caught by agreeing to voluntarily have one, even though it wasn't legally binding in Iran's case. And then the agency put it to very good use and discovered lots that Iran was doing. So it's quite a powerful thing. The other thing I would draw attention to here is the fact that the analysts at the IAEA, who previously didn't really exist, now work with inspectors to try and do a whole state evaluation for each country as to what they might be up to. So that probably would have caught the Iraq case. And you have dedicated analysts in Vienna now doing this. Before, the inspectors would come back, they may or may not file their reports, they may or may not speak to anyone in Vienna, and things could lapse. So the situation is quite different in terms of the artifacts. The espoused values are also different. So this is going through Shine's 3 areas of culture. Now there's a big emphasis on correctness and completeness. So not only should a country's declaration be correct, that is, the details match up and make sense, it should also be complete. It should include everything in the nuclear field that a country has. So this is a new mantra at the IAEA, which indicates that the culture actually has changed. But the most interesting one are the underlying assumptions. So now the underlying assumptions, and I've interviewed people about this, almost everyone says correctness and completeness is vital. They don't go on fishing expeditions still, but they do worry about different types of fish. That's the way it's been put to me. So they don't roam around countries, but they're certainly paying a lot more attention to what might or might not be declared. As I mentioned, there's close collaboration between these various groups in the agency, which is new. So inspectors used to have this status, they were like gods, someone said to me, because they were the sharp pointy end. They would go into all these, in some cases, terrible conditions to inspect plants and nuclear material. But when the analysts arrived, these eggheads, from MIT and from management consultancies who were interested in looking at data, they were a whole different species to inspectors. So you had a cultural clash within the agency between the inspectors and the analysts. These days, inspectors are much better trained. They're imbued with a new culture, as far as I can tell. And we'll come to this as far as I can tell, business. So there are continuing questions about all this. My book certainly has a lot more about culture in it. It doesn't have all the answers. And there are still lots of questions because culture is constantly evolving. And as I said, it's very difficult to have people talk about it. The IAEA doesn't ever use the word culture in any of its publications. But when you read between the lines, this is what they're talking about in some respects. The irony is that they recommend that member states attend to their culture in the safety and security areas of the nuclear business, but they don't actually recommend that for themselves as an agency. But it is there, and I can see people are doing it even though they're comfortable with the concept of culture. And it's hard to tell how widespread a culture is in an organization. You really need to do a survey, a confidential survey. You need to gather people together in a room and just let them talk. You need to do one-on-one interviews, which is a major project. I wasn't able to do that. The IAEA is rather closed in that respect. And under Mr. Romano, unfortunately, it got even more closed to NGOs and researchers. The new Director General is opening up, which is terrific. So, and I'm trying to convince him that culture is important and convince him that they should get a professional expert in cultural matters, organisational culture, in to do a survey of the agency. A real question is how this culture is holding up vis-a-vis Iran, because Iran is, as you all know, seeking to destroy the JCPOA agreement that the IAEA is verifying. And as far as I can tell, the agency inspectors have been terrific. They've done as much as they can. They've tried to use the new tools available, but Iran is a very crafty member state and has been devious and not cooperating with the agency almost in any way, and leading the agency on while it continues to move towards acquisition of a nuclear weapon. I think the culture is now alert to all of this. It would be good to know. I don't know, I'm just guessing and from talking informally to people, but that is clearly a question for the agency, because that's the difficult cases are when the culture really matters, right? It doesn't matter that much with Australia and New Zealand and Vanuatu, but it certainly matters with a country like Iran. Another question is, how will the workforce change the culture? So Mr. Grossi, the Director General of the IAEA, has 7 daughters. He revealed this at a press conference in Sydney. He is determined to have the agency be 50% women by 2024, which is amazing. It's already really climbing rapidly. He's instituted a fellowship scheme to bring young women into the nuclear field, which is all very good, but the agency needs to be aware that this will change the culture. So in the Iraq case, there was only 1 female inspector in the whole agency. This is in the 90s. Since then, they've recruited a lot more. And so the agency needs to be aware that this will inevitably change the culture and be prepared for it. It's also attempting to recruit more people from developing countries. So the mandate of the agency says it's obliged to consider geographical factors in recruitment. So not just qualifications, but the spread of its employees from various member states. And of course, as it does that, also the culture will change. And the agency, one reason it's been reluctant to talk about culture is it thinks that somehow that means overriding national cultures, which its employees bring to the agency, you know, from a variety of states, Africa, Asia. I don't agree with that, but they do have cultural sensitivities about national cultures. I try and convince them this is a different issue, but it's a bit of a push. And I'll just leave you with these 2 thoughts. So this is from the current Director General, Grossi. He just threw this out at the end. He said, and by the way, women make the best inspectors. So again, that will tell you about his thinking and also how it might change the culture. And Peter Drucker, the famous management expert guru from the 60s and 70s, his best line is, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So with that, I'll leave you with organisational culture. Thanks. Oh, no.
Maybe I'd just like to jump in from my position here, and anyone else, just stick your hand up, will come around. Looking back at Iraq and culture, I was based in the Middle East at the time, and you're sort of picking up on this, that there seemed to be an issue that some, or I don't know what percentage of the inspectors were ex-military, and that seemed to be exacerbating the position. And I mean, following your point that women make the best inspectors, I mean, same with peacekeeping, they're less confrontational. But was that a factor that the inspectors at the time were military and or American?
Great question. And I cover that in my book, but it's not the IAEA inspectors who are military or from the intelligence agencies. It was the inspectors from UNSCOM, so the UN Special Commission on Iraq. So after the war, the Security Council decided that Iraq should get rid of all its weapons of mass destruction, not just nuclear. So there was chemical, biological, missiles. So it set up UNSCOM this special body which recruited in a matter of weeks lots of intelligence agents, lots of American specialists. It was able to recruit freely. It was set up on an instant, and it went into Iraq to look after chemical, biological, and missiles. And the IAEA was allowed to look after the nuclear file because they were familiar with Iraq. They'd been doing inspections there. But the culture issue comes in because they had completely different cultures. You can imagine one was a 60-year-old UN-based organization with all the UN's procedures and just their care in the way they do things, as opposed to what some called a Rambo operation, UNSCOM, military people, intelligence officers coming in and saying, we don't need Iraq to declare anything. We're just going to go in and ask them, and we're going to go and seize documents, and we're going to, yeah, in some cases, the Iraqis were bullied. There were some incidents the IAEA had to intervene and say, no, really, this is not the way we do inspections. So there was a cultural clash there. And fortunately, they got over it when the former head of the IAEA was appointed the head of UNSCOM. So that resolved that. But there was definitely a cultural clash, and I devote a whole chapter to that in my book. But the IAEA didn't, after the Iraq case, then adopt those tactics. It reverted to its traditional culture with a few additions, like seeking documents and seeking access to places they probably would never have sought access to before.
That was going to lead on to my next question, actually, in terms of seeking access. How much notice are they obliged to give, or can they just turn up for a snap inspection and prevent stuff being?
Yes, I mean, there's this, in the public's mind, there's this snap inspection process, but unfortunately that doesn't really happen. In theory, they're obliged to give 24 hours notice, but you can imagine if the inspectors need visas to get into the country, the authorities know straight away that they're coming. If they need to hire transport to get into a runway that's near a remote facility, that also signals to the authorities. And they need visas. So the IAEA now has multiple entry visas for inspectors. They didn't used to have that. But yeah, there's really no such thing as instant access. But with satellite technology now, you can see countries moving things, and this has been Iran's downfall. We could see them scrubbing the site, moving equipment. And even in Iraq, there was a famous case of the Iraqis having moved all the centrifuges out of this building, and a very canny inspector could see a shadow on the wall in the shape of the Calitron, these machines that produced nuclear fuel, and then bolts on the floor. So human beings can be very good at spotting those things where perhaps a machine wouldn't. But so that always gives you hope that, you know, countries find it very difficult to scrub absolutely everything, including these days minute particles of radioactive material. So.
Thank you. Most interesting. Very thorough. The chart that you showed about Iraq and the shortcomings of what IAEA had revealed tells me that when Colin Powell made his presentation, that disastrous presentation that caused a war, really Colin Powell could legitimately lay some of the blame at IAEA's failures. Will you comment?
Yes, he could. But in that case, what the IAEA had gone back into Iraq, and both UNSCOM and the IAEA wanted more time. So the Americans were pressing them, of course, because they wanted to invade. So this is after the incident I'm talking about. So the agency had gone back in to try and verify that Iraq had destroyed everything as required, along with UNSCOM and then UNMOVIC, these UN bodies. So Colin Powell was quite right, but what he was doing was pushing them too hard before they'd done their job. And I think that's the tragedy of Iraq. So if they'd been allowed more time, I think they would have eventually uncovered the truth. But yeah, that whole thing, well, Colin Powell was presenting, unfortunately, misleading information. I was actually on the BBC live when he did it on a panel with Mick Jagger's wife, of all things. And it was just extraordinary. I mean, I had to make a quick judgment about whether this was real or not. And just on the face of it, you could see that some of the so-called intelligence information was wrong and that Colin had been misled. And he said before he died that it was one of the biggest regrets of his career, that he'd relied on that information to essentially begin the invasion of Iraq, the real invasion of Iraq, not the first time where they stopped at the border after bombing. So I think, yeah, blame can be put on the agency for not originally having discovered what Iraq was up to. But after that, they simply weren't given enough time.
So how come we didn't see a headline, IAEA starting a war?
Well, because they didn't.
Thank you for your wonderful speech. I had a question about leading up to the US invasion of Iraq. From my understanding, there were some inspections that were open that Iraq complied with and others that didn't. And I wanted to take you up on this idea of culture, but from the Iraqi side. So what do you think was going on in Iraq in their own culture of engagement with inspections that led to some inspections being open in the 2000s, late 90s, whereas others were not so forthright and open?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Iraqi culture, but subsequently we learned through this huge study the United States did after the invasion about what was really there, that the Iraqis were divided amongst themselves as to whether to cooperate or not. So some of it was that. Particularly lower level officials would just in a very human sort of way interact with the inspectors, but the higher levels going up to the very people who'd been building the bomb or attempting to build the bomb, they were terrified about giving up any information. So there was a real split in the government. There's also some analysis, I don't know really whether this is the case, but in that culture, one can, in defense of the people, mislead others, and that included the international inspections. So that's just been one way that it's been explained. I'm a bit skeptical about that, but that was one of the things that was said by this US report. And I think that probably applies to a lot of countries, in defense of the national interest and national sovereignty, civil servants will mislead international inspectors if they're up to nefarious purposes. So I think you probably need to ask an expert on Iraqi culture about that. But there was definitely a split, and I think that's probably more political than cultural.
Do you know what sort of access they're getting in Iran at the moment?
It's becoming more and more constrained. So initially, Iraq was providing good access and they were complying with the JCPOA. But as you know, President Trump then decided he would leave, the US would leave that agreement, and then left it open for Iran to gradually cease to comply. So that's what they've done. They've gradually ramped up the amount of nuclear material they're producing. They've ramped up the number of facilities they have. They've been building a new underground facility. They've been breaking the agreement on keeping the numbers of centrifuges low. So they've been increasing the number of centrifuges. And they're moving rapidly towards nuclear weapon capability, which means they're less and less willing to cooperate with inspections. So one stage they turned off the cameras. So Vienna wasn't getting any feed from the cameras. And then every time this happens, every time there's an Iranian pullback, then the agency goes to negotiate with them. There's some agreement and there's partial restoration of what they were obliged to do. But Iran's playing a very long game, and the IAEA is stuck in the middle. They don't have any ways in which to coerce Iran. They can simply talk to them and try and get them to comply. And the sanctions on Iran have been working in some respects, but not enough to make Iran give up its nuclear weapon ambitions. So the inspectors here are the meat in the sandwich. But having said that, satellite imagery is much better. So we can do certain things that Iran doesn't really need to cooperate with us on. And we even had the case of minute particles of nuclear material being on documents that the Iranians handed over in Vienna to make their case. That's how sensitive the technology is. And the agency's built a new laboratory outside Vienna. It's always had this laboratory. We've got brand new facilities with lots of great American equipment which can detect these minute amounts of material. So states need to be very careful about not complying and lying, because it's increasingly likely they'll be caught out.
Does the UN Security Council have a role in this? I mean, could an inspection be subject to veto by a member of the P5?
No. And in general, the Board of Governors of the IAEA keep their hands off the inspection operation, which is great. So they've mandated the inspectors to do their job, and in general, they don't interfere at all, which is very good. So the Secretariat, the Director General and his staff have a lot of freedom to pursue cases until they get compelling evidence, which they can then present to the Security Council. The Council is involved, though, in the Iran case, of course, because it was the one that certified the JCPOA agreement with Iran and the Permanent Five, so plus Germany. So it now has a say over the operation of this agreement. Not the inspection so much, but certainly the way the agreement itself operates, and the agency is verifying compliance with that agreement. So there is a linkage there with the Council. Yes.
Hi, I'm Robin Byrne.
Robin.
I was wondering, does Iran have its own uranium mines, and if not, where do they get it from? And and are other countries supplying parts that they now realise they're being used for machinery?
Iran does have its own uranium, unfortunately. So an embargo on uranium wouldn't really help very much. I think they have enough to produce their nuclear weapons. They also have civilian nuclear power reactors too, but the fuel there comes from Russia. But that's fine because the Russians take back the spent fuel. That's been a traditional great Russian non-proliferation policy. So if they provide fuel for another country's reactor, they take it back afterwards, which is better actually than the United States and other Western countries have done. So that's fine. As far as we know, there's no current Iranian legitimate acquisition of anything that will go towards the nuclear weapons program, but who knows? I mean, the black market is there still. And if they're anything like Iraq, they will milk that black market for all it's worth. The export controls are having an effect, but nonetheless, Iraq is a pretty advanced country in that respect. It can manufacture its own equipment, including centrifuges, which are very sophisticated machines, but it's managed to do that quite fine, except when they're sabotaged by others.
One more question coming in from Zoom on Iraq is that there was a view that Saddam was making out that he had this capability and all these assets, more with a view to providing a deterrent to Iran. And I mean, what extent do you think that was the case, or you know, would he have come clean with the inspectors earlier if he hadn't had an ulterior motive for trying to send a message to an adversary?
Yeah, I think there's a great paradox there. So it turns out that Saddam Hussein, because he was a dictator, wasn't being told the truth about how capable this nuclear enterprise was. I mean, the facilities were still not finished. They had a tiny amount of material in the old reactor that had been bombed. And they were getting more and more desperate, his officials were, to try and put together a bomb. And they weren't telling him that they were not able to do that in the time he wanted. So Saddam's idea that somehow he had this power, it partly accounts for his reckless behavior. He thought that Iraq was on the way to a nuclear weapon when really it wasn't. And the program itself was quite shambolic in lots of ways because he put out directives willy-nilly. The poor staff in the nuclear plants were never quite sure what the plan was. And because of the secrecy involved in governments like that, it was a huge difficulty. And I'm sure there were intelligence agents planted there by Israel and others who had a fair idea what was going on. But I think the assessment of the Americans at the end, when they did this huge study, multi-volume study on Iraq's capabilities, they realized that Iraq was very far from having a weapon. They could have had one crude device in a couple of years, but it may not have gone bang. And so what sort of deterrent is that if it doesn't work? And yeah, so the situation within Iraq was much more complicated than we realized at the time. And in many ways, Saddam was bluffing, but he believed his own bluff, unfortunately.
You briefly mentioned the word sabotage just before, and it made me think about the numerous cyber attacks that have occurred against nuclear facilities. Do those type of attacks hinder what the IAEA do, or how does it impact sort of their role when it comes to inspections and their responsibilities?
Yes, it did hinder in one case because the plant was severely damaged, which is where they would go to do their inspections and where they'd put seals and cameras. So that plant was inoperable for quite a while. So yes, it did hinder them, but because it was damaged, it meant nothing nefarious was going on. So they eventually, when the building was repaired, they were allowed access again. So in general, no, they're not hindered by those things. The machines break down. There's normally not an explosion or anything that would endanger the inspectors. In the case of Iraq, though, the inspections at one stage were halted because during the Iran-Iraq war, because inspectors feared being hit with an Iranian attack on Iraqi facilities. And even after the Israeli attack, they weren't quite sure what might be coming over the horizon. So in the Iraq case, inspections were at some stage put in jeopardy.
Trevor, you came to talk to us end of last year, I think, about AUKUS. I know not really the subject today, but there's a question, what type of inspection regime do you think might come as a result of the AUKUS, or the submarine part of the AUKUS alliance?
Yes, well, I'm not privileged to the talks that are going on in London and Washington and Canberra about this, but the officials keep insisting that this is actually going to be quite a bonus for the safeguard system. I don't quite know what that means, but I'm assuming that in fact, Australia will put the material under safeguards. So the paragraph of the safeguards agreement that we've traditionally thought applies to submarine reactors is paragraph 14, if you're interested. And it envisages essentially the scenario that Brazil has. So Brazil is manufacturing its own highly enriched uranium and it's building its own submarines. So it has a nuclear program where it makes nuclear material. It's all under safeguards. And paragraph 14, the way it was constructed, I think largely at the behest of Italy, was that if you used nuclear material, safeguarded nuclear material for nuclear propulsion in a submarine, you would remove the material from safeguards. You would tell the agency how much it was and what type it was. You would remove it from safeguards, so no inspections would apply. Then at the end of the lifetime of the submarine, you would return the material to safeguards and inspections would then resume. I think, and I don't know this is the case, and I think it would be good if Australia is going to go down this path, that in fact, because Australia is not manufacturing this material, we're importing it from the United States where it's not under safeguards, because nuclear weapon states like the US aren't under safeguards. They have nuclear weapons already. What's the point? So Australia would be importing material from the military sector in its submarines encased in the reactor. So we can't access it. We don't even know the details, specific details of the material, or we won't. So there's no question of Australia removing its own material from safeguards, putting it in the submarine and then returning it afterwards. What we're doing is importing military material from an unsafeguarded state to a non-nuclear weapon state. And under our safeguards agreement, we're obliged to report to the IAEA as you saw, all nuclear material. So I think what's being concocted is that Australia will ignore that model of taking it out and putting it back in, and we will say we're actually putting it in safeguards, under safeguards while it's in the submarine. And then we'll return the submarines to the United States. They'll destroy the submarine, crack open the reactor, take the material out and put it back in their military sector. Exactly how we will be putting it under safeguards is the big question. I don't really know what they're going to be doing because the technology is ultra secretive. Australians will not have access to the reactor. They will not have access to the material. If you want to remove nuclear material from a nuclear submarine, you have to break open the hull. It's welded in because it's a lifetime proposition. So the HEU is there for the lifetime of the submarine. So it's a mystery to me how this will happen. The Americans won't let IAEA inspectors anywhere near, I don't think, their submarines. So it's a big mystery. You could envisage, visits to ports to see that the submarine hadn't been taken apart or there's no hole in it. But beyond that, I mean, the agency certainly wouldn't be able to track submarines as they moved around. It could see them in port if they're open shipyards being refurbished or whatever, but beyond that, it would be very difficult. So this is, the Director General says, this is very difficult.
Just come to one more question.
So the option about submarines was French submarines, and the French submarines do have a nuclear component. Now, I'm not sure if they are under the IAEA agreement, but they are low fuel, a low nuclear fuel. But we don't know whether the American is high fuel, high nuclear fuel load because there's no information about that. And if the submarines are in dock and being a military target, they're targeted, then it would have a different effect if it's a low grade French nuclear engine or submarine compared to an American, which we don't know how much high grade it is. Sorry.
Right, yeah. So actually we do know the high grade. It's military grade, so it's up 92% enriched. So you're right, the Americans use highly enriched uranium. The French use low enriched uranium. But we weren't buying French nuclear powered submarines. We were buying a conventional version converted from the nuclear. So there's some argument that we now should return to the French, cap in hand, and say, sorry, we'd now like low enriched uranium fueled submarines. There are some who advocate that. And LEU is better because it's not instantly bomb material. So if you were able to cut open your submarine, you couldn't use it in a bomb straight away. You could use HEU straight away. So that's the issue. There are more complications. So the Americans are being pressed to design a low enriched uranium submarine for their next generation. The Congress is reluctant, but they've put some money into that. And there are some disadvantages with the submarines. Apparently have to be bigger. There's less room for the crew. There's all sorts of complications in this story. So the LEU situation helps from a non-proliferation point of view, except that they have to be refueled, whereas HEU submarines don't. So you've got low enriched uranium, which is not bomb material, but you're changing it over every few years, depending on the system. That's problematic. Then inspectors would have to be there because you've got fuel coming in and out of the submarine. So that's problematic. In terms of the danger to civilians in a port, it doesn't matter if it's HEU or LEU, it will be a radiological bomb. It's equally dangerous. So if you don't want nuclear material in your harbours and submarines, then go conventional.
To wrap up, can I pitch one last question, which may be an unfair curveball, but the situation in Ukraine and Russia, what role, if any, do you see for the IAEA in that regard?
So the IAEA has a huge role. So they've already sent 3 teams to both Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia. And they're trying to insist that both Russia and Ukraine take responsibility for the situation, which is the logical thing. But of course, there are always problems when one country invades another. You don't want to give recognition to the invader. Pardon me. So the Ukrainians have been a bit upset that Russia's being asked to participate in this. That's a problem. The Director General is still negotiating access to Zaporizhzhia, the one that the Russians control now. But he's been excellent. He set out these guidelines, because we never thought about this before, guidelines for what happens when one country invades another and seizes their nuclear power plant. Who knew? Who thought about that, right? It was unthinkable. So the agency have been very quick off the mark, and they've put on high alert their emergency center, Nuclear Incident Response Emergency Center in Vienna. 24 hours a day it's running. And they're providing assistance. They have an international network where states volunteer assistance to Ukraine, which they're trying to deliver, particularly to Chernobyl, which is where they have access, of course. So the agency is key. And I think this has been a huge contrast to Fukushima, where the agency were a bit like a rabbit in the headlights. It's not our problem. They didn't even have the right information about what was happening. Even though the director was Japanese and the Japanese government was responsible and should have known what was happening. This is quite different. So the agency has seized its role, which is exactly what it should do. It's got a cooperative government in Ukraine, of course. But in many ways, it's a more difficult situation because Russia is a key member of the Board of Governors. Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and its invasion of Ukraine has caused international institutes to quake all over. So it's extremely difficult.
Okay, well, on that note, a somber note, Trevor, thank you so much for giving us such a detailed overview, for coming along, taking part. We will send a link to the book out with the recording, and to the Zoom audience, apparently, if there wasn't sound at some point or sides, apologies from our end, but we'll make sure you get the recording. So, Trevor, thank you very much again. Please join us.